All right, so we are going to start the final video of this build series and finally finish this workbench. So it starts with getting the bottom relatively flat. I'm not trying to get it perfect. I'm just trying to fill any of the big bad cracks and crevices and knot holes with epoxy, which I've already done at this point, and then just get where the legs are going to mortise and tenon through. I want to get that area as flat as I possibly can. So I'm hitting it with the planer, the smoothing plane, and just some 80 grit sandpaper on the old, actually the brand new Bauer random orbital sander from Harbor Freight, which incidentally I'm really digging having this orbital sander. All right, so I've got the bench top upside down, and I'm flipping the. So I've got the bench top upside down, so I'm flipping the base on top of the bottom of the bench just to kind of get an idea of where I'm going to lay out the mortises. So the tenons are already cut on the uprights. We saw that in previous episodes. So now I've got them all marked out. It's time to start cutting some square holes. So I'm starting with a paddle bit just to hog out a bunch of the material out of the center of the mortise. And I'm going to come back with a hammer and chisel and knock out the rest. So let me finish punching these holes first. So you saw me use some glue and a clamp, and basically I got a little too overzealous with my chisel work, and I went all the way through rather than go about 3/4 of the way through, then flip the bench top over and get the rest. So what happened is I blew out a chunk, so I had to glue it back down. I did that actually on 3 out of 4 of the mortises. So apparently I didn't learn my lesson. It's always that last couple of hammer blows that you want to do but probably shouldn't do that cause the problem. All right, so now I go through the pain in the backside of fitting this up. Man, I wrestle with this a lot. See me climbing up on top of it, trying to pound it down. Again, I want this to be tight, and I want the mortise and tenon joint because it's going to be visible on the bench top. I want it to be as close to perfect as I can get, but eventually I realize it's not going to be. There's a little bit of gaps, so I end up widening the gaps all the way around and created eventually a wedged tenon. So here I am kind of widening that, just accepting the reality that I'm not going to get a perfectly tight fit on all 4 of them because nothing is perfectly square. Top's sort of on. Got a lot of work to do, a lot of finessing. There's about an 1/8 of an inch gap between the shoulders of the mortise on these diagonal corners, which I'm not surprised. I was kind of expecting 2 of these to be a little bit taller than the other just because of the wobble that I had. Now I'm not sure if it's because I'm on some wood chips that's fixed that wobble on the legs. It's not as nearly as bad. Now that might be due to the stress that putting this on and off has, put on the table. But I think this height is just about right for my 6'4" height. This is going to be great to plane. Matter of fact, let's see how great this is to plane. Oh, yeah. is going to be phenomenal. So I think we got the beginnings of a great workbench. Got a lot of fine tuning and finesse work to do before I can put finish on this thing and call this thing done. All right, so the first step in wedging these up is going to be to get the tabletop off, which is fun. So I finished widening them out just a little bit more. But it's still pretty snug. I want about 1/8 of an inch or so reveal all the way around. So that's about what I'm doing here. Just so it goes on and off pretty easily, and then I can fill the space with some wedges. And of course I do this wrong. I should have done like a V cut, but I didn't. I just did a line down the middle. I first drilled a hole all the way through the tenon, and then I'm taking my Japanese pole saw and just cutting it right down the middle. And that was probably my first big cut with that Japanese pole saw, and I managed to have the blade wander. So I go with a traditional Western blade on the next couple ones until I can get some more practice in with the Japanese pole saw. Eventually I do get the hang of it, and it's probably my favorite saw now. What's different about it is, Western type saw, for those of you who aren't familiar, cuts on the push stroke, and the Japanese saw cuts on the pull. So once you get the hang of it, you can actually make some really, really precise cuts with it. And it's, of course, it's completely flush, which I'm going to use right here. So I wasn't able to take up the gap by splitting the tenon. The reason why I drilled the hole is because I wanted to prevent it from actually splitting all the way through. But I should have cut a wider kerf. Just a single saw kerf wasn't wide enough. I should have cut like a V, kind of a notch in it instead. So I ended up having to put some more wedges all the way around the perimeter. It ends up looking pretty cool. It's just not really what I intended, but I'll take it. I got a little cocky on that inside one there with the Japanese pole saw, and actually ended up cutting a little bit of the bench top away with the exposed tenon. But I'll show you how I fix that later with some epoxy. But now I get a really good cut. That was a perfectly good flush cut, so eventually I started to get the hang of the Japanese pole saw. Now it's time to get everything kind of leveled off and ready for some final epoxy. So I'm getting everything as square and as sanded down roughly with 80 grit paper that I can to get ready for all the remaining epoxy. And man, I spent probably about a week and a half getting all this epoxy in. This particular blue epoxy, that when I went back and did the second coat, I couldn't, for whatever reason, I didn't mix it right, and it never dried, it never cured, so that was a blast to take care of. Always be precise with your measurements when mixing epoxy. Epoxy that doesn't cure and dry is probably the worst thing ever. So this is that second coat that wouldn't dry, so I'm covered. Oh boy, I made the mistake of let's just cover it with masking tape. It's been drying for about 2 days now and it still hasn't cured, so I decided, hey, I'm just going to cover it with masking tape so it doesn't ooze all over the place, and I'm going to move on to the other side of the bench. And hopefully by the time this side cures, that side will cure. Never did. But I ended up getting it off and getting it flush, and it's okay now. So again, I'm just getting the just those side fascias leveled off, because it's, obviously it's 4 different types of wood there between the breadboard ends and the little decorative stuff that I did, and none of it was quite the same thickness, so I ended up playing it all down to the same thickness. Now I'm filling in all the cracks and crevices with epoxy. I chose to do some orange on this side, and I really like how this turns out. Again, this is stuff that most people are never gonna see, but these little touches, when I'm looking for them and see them, they just make it have this piece have so much character, and I really like that. All right, so I'm getting all of the dust out because it's now time to work on the top and the shelf. So all of the uprights and the stretcher, all of that epoxy has been mixed. So now I'm going on to the top and I'm going on to the shelf. So I'm trying to make up my own color green here. I end up using like 3 shades of green, and I add some silver metallic flake in there too. I was just playing around. I ordered this sample pack of colors and I just couldn't decide on a theme, so I just decided to basically try them all. So mixed up quite a bit of that green. And again, these little tiny cracks, I wouldn't call them cracks, it's just bad joinery because I didn't get the pieces planed very well. It just didn't, I had to fill in quite a bit between each seam of board. So that's what it looked like by the time I was done pouring all the different colors of epoxy. It looked like a clown threw up on this thing. So I finally figured out a good way to, rather than using a hand plane, to get this epoxy off, and that's just a 5-in-1 tool, scraper, and the heat gun. And it comes right off. And I still finish it up with hand plane and the orbital sander, but to get off the big thick chunks, man, this works awesome. The trick is to get it, within 72 hours of pouring the epoxy. Obviously, your manufacturer may vary. There's that stuff that never quite stuck, never quite cured. See, I'm wearing respirator. Even knuckleheads like me learn eventually. Alright, so I'm back. This is the next day after sanding. I did put a little bit of touch-up epoxy in just some of the spots where it was bugging me on the top. And there's plenty of other ones that are kind of on the legs and on the sides. And I have to remind myself, hey, when it's done, and nobody's ever going to see it. And I hate people who say that nobody's ever going to see it, because I know it's going to be there. So if it continues to bug me later on, then I will address it. But the point I'm trying to make for myself anyway is that this is a workbench, and this is going to be nice and pretty for a total of 1 day. The first project I build on this is going to scratch it and dent it and ding it, and it's not going to be as pretty as it is the minute I rub Danish oil on it for the first time. It'll never be that pretty again. I chose to use this old pallet wood for a reason, because I wouldn't care about messing it up. And it was a good experience to practice with wood that didn't matter if I messed up. So it proved to be a challenge because of that, because none of the grain is in the same direction on any single piece of wood. It's definitely had its share of challenges. I would have been done probably with 3 of these benches in the time it has taken me with this one using milled lumber. But anyway, this has been a fun learning experience. So the next 2 steps I have before I can put finish on this is to scrape off in the same manner the excess epoxy that I put on to fill these little gaps. I want to go back over the top again with 80 grit sandpaper just to get a little bit of the waves out. So I'm going to go against the seams. Most of my sanding last night was kind of with the grain of the seams or against it, but focused in very, very specific areas on the bench to try and get this epoxy off. So now I just want to get it smooth. So I'll hit the top with 80 again, then I'll hit the whole thing with 120, and I'm debating on whether or not I'm going to do 220 on just the top or on the whole thing. Certainly the areas that have the most epoxy on it, because I want that to actually have a little bit of a gloss to it. So we'll see. 120 for sure across the whole bench, and possibly 220, maybe just on the top. That could end up being on the entire bench too. We'll see. Anyway, let's get after it. All right, now that I got my yapping taken care of, I'm getting off the little bit of epoxy that I poured just to kind of do touch-ups with. So I go through the same process that I went through earlier. No big deal. Now I'm doing the finish sanding. So I go all the way up from 80 grit to 120 to 220. So that's a ton of sanding. Actually, I think I started with 60. So yeah, 60, 80, 120, 220. Now I'm leveling off the breadboard ends with a hand plane. It's my Bailey number 4 smoothing plane. Makes quick work of it. I'm doing the finish sanding on the top. Now that I got the breadboard ends leveled off. Doing the sides. Man, that looks good, doesn't it? Not bragging. Alright, the time has finally come for me to put finish on this workbench that I've been working on seemingly forever. So everything is sanded to a 220 grit finish. Even the legs and the sides and the uprights, everything is sanded to 220. I'm just going to take some Danish oil, microfiber cloth, and I'm just going to rub it into the wood. Probably do, I don't know how many coats. Could be as many as 4, could be as few as 2, but certainly I think this thing is going to soak up a lot of oil, especially in some of this open grain structure. So let's get to it, man. I can't wait to see what this thing looks like. I think it's going to be beautiful. Alright, now it's time to put the first coat of oil on. Man, I'm super excited. At first, I don't like it because I've been, looking at it in the raw form for as long as I have. That any kind of change to it just kind of changes my opinion. But man, now that I've had it finished for a couple months or a month and a half, I just absolutely love it. I'm glad I didn't use any kind of a stain. This is just regular Danish oil. I ended up doing about 3 coats on the shelf and the uprights and the sides. And then on the top, I probably have done about 5 coats with sanding in between. Because every time I get a little bit of a scratch, because it's still so new, I want to sand out the scratch and then reapply finish. Eventually I'm going to have to get over that, but I'm just super thrilled to be finished with this. I still have to do the vices. I've got a 7-inch Woodworkers vise from Pony that I got for Christmas that is going to go on first, and then I'm going to design and build my own. It's going to be a tail vise or an end vise, but it's going to be a twin screw end vise, kind of like a Moxon vise, but it's going to be integral to the bench. So I can do a couple of neat things. I still need to drill dog holes, but I'm scared to do it. That's my favorite piece of wood on the whole bench right there. The figure on it is just awesome. But there you have it, everybody. If you've watched this series from the very beginning, thank you so much for your patience. I know I started this about 7-8 months ago, I think July of last year, and here we are in March, and I'm finally finished. Obviously, I finished this about a month and a half ago, actual work, but it's taken me this long to catch up on all the video editing. But thank you so much for watching. We'll get back to some regular bass guitar content soon, but first I got to finish dressing out the workshop, and I'll probably sneak in some bass stuff in between. I got some new gear that I want to share and do reviews on. But anyway, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on The Basement.